Hi. A dusty accordion wheezes to life. A cartoon brass band trudges past. A music box opens and chimes a forgotten melody. A choir of singing saws raise their angelic voices to bend and lift above the trees. And from this orchestra of toys comes Jeff Mangum singing sincerely of the circus wheel, of Christmas trees in the snow, of a two-headed boy floating in his jar of spirits. What world is this? A world yellowed like an old storybook or a postcard. A world of memory, but not of the past. It's nostalgia, history in a snow globe. In and out of the music floats the ghost of a child, Anne Frank. After reading Anne Frank's diary, Mangum dreamed for nights on end of a time machine that would allow him to go back and save her. He wrote a song, Holland, 1945. The song was a time machine, built in a dream. But nothing works right in dreams. The machine traveled to a time that never existed, where war got jumbled with comets and pianos and brothers Anne never had. But here Jeff can hide her when her secret annex behind the bookshelf has been trampled by jackboots. Nostalgia is the pair of white roses he sets on her eyes to keep her blind and innocent and safe. As a child, Joseph Cornell went to Coney Island with his family and explored the penny arcade. Feed a penny, a box bestows a vision, a fortune, a silver charm. As an adult, he roamed New York, piecing together this memory, which was not of the past. He collected cork balls, clay pipes, metal rings, and toy goblets and sealed them into boxes. Like something reconstructed from a dream, the boxes were games, but whose secret rules made them unplayable. Dioramas, but whose scenes were treacherously unstable. shadow boxes, but whose keepsakes were dime store trinkets that only a child could cherish. Then he added her, his little Medici princess, a Renaissance princess in a Victorian shadow box. Nostalgia was jumbling up history again. But a shadow box, which displays, also preserves, and so here he preserved her with her toys and treasure maps, a child forever. When Cornell had given up carpentry, he went to the workshop where the shells of his boxes were constructed to his specifications. This shy, formal man placed the container on the floor, stepped up onto it, and pounced furiously up and down. Princess, if in your sleep you hear tremors, sleep on. It is only Joseph shoring up the fortifications of your dream world. So some of these themes appear in my work over and over again. The theme of forever childhood, the theme of history that's made into kind of Neverland. So I don't think of what I'm about to present you as a story per se, as much as kind of an exploration or an essay in which I've tried to personify this impulse that I've been describing. So I'm going to have my friend Colin Hubbard come up and help me read something. All right, so this is called the skeleton leaf. So Peter Pan wore this costume, not in the Disney film, in the book, and it was made of skeleton leaves and tree sap, and he was invisible to adults, but his appearance in the night was kind of given away the next morning when you would find these skeleton leaves on the floor next to the open window.
He was presented to us by our parents as a figure of great nobility. As he toddled out from behind their legs, our parents beamed. We fidgeted, aware of the grotesque nostalgia that had overtaken them. Before we could claim homework to do or rooms to clean, their smiles had vanished behind the softly creaking door. He looked around, sizing everything up.
I am pleased to make your acquaintance and have long waited to familiarize myself with this land and its people. So far, I must report, I've only been disappointed to find the flora colorless, the fauna timid, and the air so bland I might suffocate from lack of interest. This will clue you into the kinds of fantastic places I typically find myself.
At first glance, he was, like us, a child. He'd come dressed for play in a windblown scarf and a brocaded seafaring cap, and around his neck hung an old-fangled device with a dial on it. So what are you, then? We asked. Some kind of explorer.
Why, an explorer is exactly the kind of thing I am. I'm currently on the most unprecedented expedition, a search taken at such demon speed as to blur all known geography into a hazy new singularity. Teeming cities occur to me as quick and shallow as a hummingbird's breath.
And so on. The improvising and carrying on was apparently what he meant by exploring. But soon, deeper peculiarities emerged. The hair that had curled from under his sea cap, by which we first pegged him as a towhead, now occurred to us as actually being white, and a closer squint at his pink cheeks divulged an intaglio of superfine creases. While he was every inch of him a child, in one dimension he had grown enormous, time. He seemed the victim of a curse.
I have been out chasing the wind, you could say, but here I've found occasion to pause in my travels. For when your parents shut the door, they created a temporary vortex, where the wind turned in on itself, for it never stops moving, you see, and neither do I. Would you like to play a game?
What kind of game, we asked.
I have lost something precious to me, only I have forgotten what it is. In this game, which is called a story, we shall remember it together. It shall be me and you and the cunning wind. You will listen and believe everything I say, for it is all of it completely true, and I will speak using only the finest, most convincing words and never once bore you.
And what will your cunning wind do, we asked.
The wind will blow here, there, and who knows where, but we shall never be more than a step behind. Shall I begin?
Okay, go ahead.
Deep in the heart of a vast and secret forest there lived an adventurer prince. His days were spent in death-defying stunts among high treetops and in foot races with quick young foxes. If he discovered the snakes whispering, he yanked them up by their tails until they confessed what they'd been conspiring about. He didn't like any secrets in his secret forest that he didn't know about. Now, you're already wondering what was so secret about this forest. Well, you see, the forest had been planted to conceal a secret cave, and way down inside the secret cave there hid a secret observatory. When the adventurer prince got tired of adventures, he crawled down into his secret observatory where nobody could bother him.
observatory at the bottom of a cave?
A fine question. This observatory, please understand, was equipped with a highly specialized device, the seeing instrument. It was like a submarine's periscope, only much more powerful due to the quality of its countless lenses and mirrors. The periscope enabled the adventurer prince to monitor the farthest wilds of his forest. And as this was his job, now you see why such an elaborate device was so necessary.
His need to convince us created a momentum that, like a wind, whisked right along, but arrived nowhere in particular. Case in point, the forest's purpose was to conceal the observatory, and the observatory's purpose was to survey the forest. And so we'd only swirled around in a big circle.
But in a fine story such as this, bliss can never last. And so one morning, the adventurer prince peeped out through his periscope and noticed some troubling activity on the fringes of his forest. Beyond the forest lay a kingdom that had long sought to inflate its borders. The kingdom's ruler was a queen who was basically a child-eating psychopath who had her own ideas about forests. The forest had to look a certain way before she would deign to prance around in it. And so her people, the officers of the royal forest, as they were called, busied themselves organizing the trees by height and pulping any that were too bendy to do anything with, which was most of them. The beasts, too, they trapped, and when you saw them again, they never bellowed or tore clumps of grass. They only stood there in their freshly laundered coats and nodded at you like a smug usher. So, what did the adventurer prince do when the officers of the royal forest, when he saw them intruding on his realm? He assembled a detachment of wolves and bears, and one night, under the cover of darkness, and you know to listen closely here because of the darkness, they snuck up on the enemy encampment. The officers of the royal forest were cutting loose after a long day of collating trees. A young girl had come from the castle, and they were beating their spoons on their metal dinner trays as she danced around the fire. Poised just beyond the firelight, the adventurer prince had never seen anything so pretty as the little dancing girl's weary eyes. She didn't want to dance, but the officers of the royal forest had learned a little of their queen's black magic, and by beating their metal trays faster and faster, they made the girl spin so hard that her clothes flew off into the fire. Then, when she was naked and dusty and not nearly so pretty, the officers of the royal forest went one by one to her in the tent, where a sort of scuffle took place, and they shouted the name of God at her until she cried. And one by one they returned to the fire, a little more quiet and sheepish than before, suspecting they had themselves been put to some strange use by their queen's magic. The adventurer prince turned to find his wolves and bears gone. At the sound of metal, they instinctually desert. But what could he do alone against such a sinister power? He hurried back to the safety of his observatory and took a nap.
A nap, we said?
Yes, a most profound and highly necessary nap. A good nap can do wonders against dangers of all sorts.
But everybody knows that what your hero must do now is swallow his fear and make a difficult discovery. In this case, he's obviously courting a revelation about adults' unseemly sexual appetites. And then, armed with this hard-won knowledge, he can go on to tromp his enemy.
Nonsense. Is this how stories are told in this land? It's perverse. I tell you, I won't be forced into anything like that direction. And won't you feel foolish when I inform you that upon waking in the morning, the adventurer prince looked through his periscope and discovered a forest as wild as the day before humans walked the earth. Yes, the firelit faces, the queen and all her encroaching kingdom had been a dark dream, for he was a vivid dreamer who sometimes stumbled into troubling visions.
This "it was all a dream" device is possibly the dustiest contraption in all of storytelling. We were almost glad to witness someone in all earnestness try to use it.
And from here the story improves, for the forest, now enrobed in golden morning light, fell enchanted, like something from a storybook. Braided brooks whispered strange names against the tree roots, and the trees yawned awake and stretched their young song-filled nests to the sky, so that every day was a hymn to the sun. The adventurer prince clung to the eyepiece of his periscope, and if sometimes rumbles from above threatened to distract him, he only pressed his eye harder to it. But the pain in his eye socket was relatively mild, when just think how ready you were to cash it all in. Doesn't this beat your so-called difficult discovery?
Fuss and fabulate as he may, his escapism failed to move us. Boredom swelled in our chests. It rose up in our throats and condensed into a cavernous, tear-inducing yawn.
And all night the frogs crooned and the crickets fiddled and hey, stop it!
We can't help our physiological response, we said. The wind has gone out of your story.
Has not!
But as he shook and examined the dial hung around his neck, his ancient tongue was already groping his baby teeth in search of new ideas. If he couldn't convince us, he couldn't convince himself.
I told you the wind was cunning, didn't I? It hasn't gone out. It merely changed direction. So, okay, here's what happened. One day, the adventurer prince looked through the periscope and caught one last glimpse of his forest before it gave a flimsy shudder like a departing wave and vanished.
Vanished, we said? That's overcompensating a little.
Yes, vanished. See, the adventurer prince had only thought he was awake, but really he was still napping. And what a spectacular nap it was. It almost seemed worth it. All the while, however, the officers of the royal forest had been hard at work, so when the adventurer prince scrambled up from his cave, all he found was the neck of his periscope protruding from a barren hilltop. The rest of the forest was gone, except for a row of trees in the distance, as straight as the buttons on a captain's jacket. There was nothing that could be done.
If he couldn't have fairy tales, then he would have fatalism, anything to keep his hero from having to struggle, we noticed. He looked older and more cursed than ever.
He looked out over his desolation. The landscape had grown cold and blustery. There was nothing to see, just some trash mixing in the wind.
What a terribly affecting detail. What kind of trash was it?
Oh, just some papers, and a black umbrella that the wind was dragging along the ground.
It is to his credit that even at this, his bleakest moment, he left himself a tiny opening. Trash is never just trash. From an umbrella and a few papers, our storyteller could build an entire realm.
But when he wiped the obscuring tear from his eye, he discovered that the dragging umbrella was actually a woman out on a walk. And not just any woman, but the child-eating queen herself. An officer walked beside her, taking readings off a dial-faced instrument.
This sounds more promising.
So the adventurer prince grasped a nearby rock and stormed across the open waste, vowing to knock the crown from the queen's head. But his legs had grown weak under his periscope, so before he could quite kill her, he collapsed at the hem of her immense black dress.
And so now all of your story needs is some dialogue. How did we ever make it so far without any?
I don't do it for your sake. This is how the story ends.
Then by all means, we said, end it.
Finding an adventurer prince so abruptly displayed at their feet, the queen and her officer jumped. "Ah," said she, "the little mole came up for air." "I came up for blood," said our hero. "Yours." "You won't have much success there," said she. "My blood runs much too thick. It's impossible to get it out of me." "What have you done with it?" said he. "Done with what, dear?" said she. It, said our hero, pointing everywhere. "My forest." She asked the officer what he'd done with the poor thing's forest. "What?" said the officer. "The one from the storybook." "Yes," said she, "that one." "We taped it to the end of his periscope," said the officer. "Like you said. The wind must have blown it off. It's been terribly windy out here." "Did you use the good tape?" said she, "this extra sticky kind?" He blushed. "Well, phoo," said she. She then explained the dirty trick they'd played. When they discovered an adventurer prince was living in the forest, they didn't want to mar his virtue with all the off-color things the officers of the royal forest got up to. So they cut a picture from a storybook and taped it over the end of his periscope. Having pulped so many trees, the kingdom had more than enough paper, more paper than they knew what to do with, and so they gotten good at making convincing storybooks that could lull the adventurer prince into a long and safe sleep. "It was only for your own good," said the queen, "for we certainly thought fondly of you, nestled down there in your innocence. It's only a shame the good tape wasn't used." "My forest," said our hero, "gone." "Not gone," said she, "taken." "Gone," said he. "I wish you'd just eat me already." "Dear," said she, "I'd no sooner eat you than I'd eat a wax scrape." So there, upon the empty waste, the queen and the adventurer prince hatched a plan. She would present him with an instrument, a barometer, which she would anoint with black lint from her dress pocket, though she called it magic dust. And bearing this device as his crest, he would hunt the wind, and when he finally had reclaimed his forest, he would bring it back to her. For if she could make a forest into paper, she could surely make paper into a forest. He need only believe. And he knew that he did believe. In fact, believing had always been what he was best at.